We find in Acts chapter 17, verse 10 and 11 specifically, we'll look at in just a second, but Paul is on his second missionary journey, and he's just gone to Thessalonica, and he reasoned with them there in the temple over the scriptures for several weeks. We see about in verse 10 that they had to ultimately secret him away in the dark of the night because of a mob that was forming because of the words that he was preaching, and gone on to Berea. So specifically in Acts chapter 17, then verse 10 to 11, we read, "These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness, and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so." So the reason I bring that up is I pray that whether you're visiting with us or a member of the local body, that you are more like the Bereans than the Jews in Thessalonica tonight. And let's open up our Bibles together and study them and reason from the scriptures together. I appreciate the passage that was read a few moments ago in Matthew chapter 11, and also the songs that Jim picked out. They were a great lead-in to our discussion this evening. The title of our discussion is going to be Into the Garden, as you might have seen in the bulletin that we sent out. And if I had to stick with our tradition and pick three words for us to focus our thoughts on, I would pick out faith, trust, and peace as those. So I'm not sure about what your individual personal circumstances might have been over the past 2 years, but I feel fairly safe in saying that for most of us, the last few years have been pretty unique in the types of stresses and types of anxieties and the challenges that we've had to go through, the worries, the fears. I wanted to share a few statistics with you this evening that may or may not surprise you in this regard, but it really hit home as I went through some of these. There was a study done just a couple of months into 2020, into the pandemic. This was, say, around the middle of 2020, done by the American Psychological Association. And they opened their study and their findings with a couple of quotes that really stuck out. Americans have been profoundly affected by the pandemic, resulting in real consequences on our minds and on our bodies. We are facing a national mental health crisis that could yield serious health and social consequences for years to come from the increased stress, the physical, emotional toll, not only of the COVID situation, but all the other normal society things that were thrust upon us at that time. It's interesting that in their survey, and listen to these numbers, 49% of the people that they surveyed reported that their behavior had been negatively affected by these stress levels. 21% said there was tension to their bodies. 21% reported snapping and making irate outbursts, even at loved ones. And 20% had unexpected and drastic mood swings. Now let's fast forward to another study that was done by the American Institute of Stress only about 90 days ago. About 90 days ago, this was around the end of May of 2022. And it's interesting to hear the statistics, what's happened in the last year and a half to us. 33% of the people reported feeling extreme stress. But here's where the numbers began to jump. 77% experienced stress that affected their physical health. 73% experienced stress that affected their mental health. 48% had trouble sleeping. 50% said the stress was getting worse versus getting better. We went from about 49% to 77% in about 18 months. That's the impact that these different things that have happened around us in the last 2 years have had. So what does that stress look like? How is it manifested? How would you know if it's affecting you or not? 45% of the people said they reported anger or irritability. 41% said fatigue and no energy. 38% lack of motivation or interest in things. 36% anxiety, worry, nervousness. 34% headaches, depression. All these things included things like appetite change, muscle tension, upset stomach, weight changes. So where did they say all of this stress was coming from? More than 3 out of 4, 77%, said the number of issues that are facing our country were overwhelming to them. Other concerns were health care, mass shootings, global warming, suicide rates, immigration, sexual harassment or assault, drug epidemics. Those were the big ones, all 50% or higher. And then money, economy, relationships, all of these other things. So what's the result of all of that stress? What has happened? What impact has it had on us? Over $300 billion, with a B, dollars annually on health care costs and lost productivity from companies linked to stress. It's a contributing factor to almost every leading cause of death. And having worked at the American Heart Association for 2 years, I know the impact of this on heart disease, cancer, lung disease, accidents, suicide. Now, it's interesting to note that when stress is high and someone is desperate to relax, one of the first things that some people will turn to will be alcohol and other substances. And that's kind of a paradox because those two things actually create more stress, and it just becomes cyclical and building upon itself, frequently leading to addiction and dependence on those things. But I would say the greater impact that has come, more so than the financial impact, more so than the mental health impact, more so than the physical health impact it might have, all of this stress, I think the bigger impact is on our spiritual health. What do I mean when I say that? Because many times what we find when we're dealing with these questions and these things that are coming up, all the things that we mentioned, mass shootings, abortion rights, gender things, and all the things that are going with this, when we deal with those and we struggle with that, we can very easily find ourselves falling into this rhythm of something that we hear every day in the world. Why is God allowing this to happen? Why? What's His plan? What do we see? If He loved us, would He be allowing this to happen? And I tell you, brethren, when we fall victim to that kind of thinking and find those thoughts entering our head or coming out of our mouth, it causes us to challenge God directly. It causes us to challenge His plan. It causes us to challenge His power, His love, and His control over things in this world. And once we do that, it can create a distance in our relationship with God and ultimately to cause us to lose our soul. So, for most of us, I would say these things are very likely things that we have not had to face before, or at least not to the quantity of them or the intensity of them. And although they may be new to us, I would propose to you tonight that they're not new to this world. None of them. Nor are they new to God. See, God's plan from the very beginning that we read in Ephesians chapter 1 included creating man with his own free will. And with that free will comes the consequences of those choices. And it could be the consequences of our own choices, or it could be the consequences of someone else's choices, or it could be simply time and chance. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, a verse we're all familiar with, that which has been is what will be. That which is done will be done, is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. So what I'd like for us to think about this evening, what does that mean, nothing new under the sun? We can go back as early as the garden, and very early in Genesis, we can see in chapter 2 that the choices and the consequences were very clearly laid out to Adam and Eve. What tree they could eat, and what trees they couldn't, and what the consequences of that were going to be. Already in chapter 3, if we're looking at it, in the writings, it's only a few verses forward that we see that they made their choice, and we see what consequences were that followed. But we can continue to fast forward, go through other places. We're not going to go through all of these, But if you just look, and I put them on this list, I know it's a little bit small font to get them on there, but I want you to just kind of be able to visualize, because we're not going to go through all of them, that we can find examples of all the things we've talked about as we just start in Genesis and start working forward. Talk about the high crime rates in Chicago and New York and what people are doing to each other. We didn't make it out of Genesis chapter 4 to somebody's already killed his brother. So these things aren't new. They may be new to you, they may be new to me, but they're not new. They're not new to the world, and they're not new to God. We can look at all the Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers. We saw extensive famines. We see slavery with the Israelites in various captivities. We see battles and wars constantly between kingdoms. We see it even for God's people when he leads them into the promised land. They had to possess that land. There were brutal battles fought and there were wars fought. We tend to think about them sometimes in the context of just reading about the battles, but not realizing there were people living there. There were things going on. I'm sure they were scared to death. There was stress. There was a lot going on that you can imagine with wars. There's always been horrible kings and good kings, bad kings and good kings. If you look at all the kings of Israel and Judah, there's only about 5 of the 20 that were good kings. The rest of them made horrible decisions and brought pain upon the people. There's been constant famines, droughts. We can even look at things when we look at we talk about abortion today, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. When we go back, look at the mass genocides of infants, right? Look, it doesn't take long to look in Exodus chapter 1 and see what Pharaoh did to try to stop Moses. And it doesn't take us long to get forward into the New Testament to see Herod doing the same thing. You're talking about wiping out entire populations of that. So these things aren't new. And the point is, over and over and over again, we see examples of the chaos that comes when man begins to try to chart his own course and not look to God and rely on God for our guidance. But God provides us the answer. He not only warns us that this is going to happen, but he provides us the answer as well. We look, and these are passages, again, we'll go through pretty quickly just for the sake of getting to some of the deeper subjects here in a minute. But Jeremiah chapter 10:23. It's not in man who walks to direct his own footsteps. Proverbs 14:12. There's ways that seem right to me and you, to our governments, to our leaders, whoever that might be, but it's a way that leads to death. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Again, the answer is trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding, but in all of our ways acknowledge him, and our paths will be straight. When we're dealing with that kind of stress, we'll know what to do. We'll know how to handle that. Let's not look to ourselves. And this is going to be a common theme. I used to have a college professor that every time he said something that was going to be on the test, he'd stomp his foot. This is a foot stomping moment. If you think about that, hold that thought, because these things aren't new. And if we need to know how we handle them and who we turn to for that guidance, that's where we're going to come to in this lesson. So how can we know what that answer is if he provides it? 3 passages very clear, and there's a whole lot of others that go along. I just picked 3 of these out. But 2 Peter 1:3 tells us that he's given us everything we need to know. We don't have to guess at anything. Not most things, not some things, and we got to keep it in the context that all the things we're experiencing today, he's already seen. He knows those things already, and they've happened before. 2 Timothy 3:16 says the things that he's given us, the word that we read about in 2 Peter 1:3, is profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction. It's everything we need. It will guide us to the things that we need, and if we use it properly and divide it rightly, Psalms 119, that word will be a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. Not only did he give us the word, but I think even more importantly, if there is a more importantly, he provided us his son. We know that he loved us, his creation, as a unique, special creation and relationship with man, that he loved us so much that he gave his son so that we might have a relationship with him. Not only did he give us his son for that lasting relationship, but he's also put him in that role of a great high priest. So let's turn and read this passage together, if you would. I think this is important enough to take the time out to read this one. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. All my passages I'll be reading from the New King James if you're following along. Hebrews 4, 14 through 16. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to do what? To help us in the time of need. He did not just put us here on this earth with this hope of this eternal relationship with Him, but He gave His Son in a much more immediate way to us that we can also take advantage of. He's not sitting there watching, hoping we figure all of this out, but He gives us His Son as that high priest who knows what we've been through. In fact, we look at Ephesians chapter 1, we can know that in Him we have redemption through His blood. That's the eternal part of that we know that we can hang on to. But also the passage that we read as our opening, Matthew 11:28. That's an immediate thing. That's not someday. That's today. That's tonight when you've watched the news or something's happened in a job loss or an illness in your family. That's today. That's immediate. It's the relationship that God has given us in His Son. Come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And then 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1 reiterates that same thing, that we can cast our cares and anxieties and our stress and our concerns on Him because He does care for us. So this evening, our focus is around Matthew 26, verses 36 through 56. And Sean mentioned a portion of that this morning on around the table, the latter part of that, and these are the verses immediate to that. So let's take the time to turn there and reason together from that. Matthew chapter 26, begin reading in verse 36. Matthew 26, beginning in verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And He took with Him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and He began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then He said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." And He went a little further and fell on His face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then He came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again, a second time He went away and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup cannot pass from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And He came and He found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So He left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then He came to His disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So let's stop for a second in the middle of this passage here at this point and think about what is the context about what is going on. He's now in the last final days of His life. He tells us in verse 1, He's with His disciples. He tells them the Passover's coming in 2 days. This is earlier in that chapter. Tells them the Passover's coming in 2 days, and after that, He's going to be crucified. He tells them that. The chief priests, the elders, all the people that should have loved to hear about His coming started in verse 3 to already plot to kill Him, to trick Him into a mock trial and have Him killed. A couple of verses later, verse 14 and 16 of this chapter, Judas has already gone and said, "What will you give me if I turn him over to you and betray him?" And then immediately before this, at the Passover meal, He's with them, and He tells them that one of them is going to betray Him. Jesus also, right before this, then tells Peter that He knows him personally is going to betray Him that very night. So as we read through those things and think about the context and put it in the context of the passages, these things happened right before he went into the garden to pray. What are the things that you think might have been weighing heavy on his mind at that point? Do you think there would have been any stress from the human side, any anxiety? Right? When he looks at it, he knows fully well the pain that's coming. He knows there's going to be a mock trial. He knows he's going to be convicted of it. He knows the beatings are coming. He knows the scourgings are coming. He knows the mockery's coming. He knows the humiliation is coming. Most of all, he knows the physical pain that's going to be coming from that crucifixion. He knows that. He also knows full well that 2 of his own disciples are going to betray him. One of them is going to sell him out. He knows that. He also knows the other one of his closest friends and confidants, is going to deny even knowing him. But ultimately, you think about what he knows when he's there on his knees in the garden praying to his Father. He knows the full weight of the sins of mankind are going to be laid on him on that cross. I can't think of anything that we might be going through that might cause more stress and more anxiety for that. In fact, when we look at Luke's account, Luke says in chapter 23, he talks that he, being in agony is the word he uses. He said his sweat became like what? It was so intense that it became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. So when we think about that, what was weighing on his mind, how intense it must have been, what did he do? What was his reaction to that stress? Let's look at verse 36 specifically. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane. He went to a quiet place somewhere. Didn't go to the middle of the temple. Didn't go to the middle of the town. He went off to a garden, to a quiet place. What else did he do? Verse 37 says he gathered his disciples, his closest ones. He said to the disciples, first, sit here while I go and pray over there. But he also took with him his closest spiritual friends. He didn't go down and grab the chief priest or the elders or the scribes. He didn't look through the town for any type of the major philosophers that might have helped him, but he grabbed his closest spiritual friends and believers and men of faith around him. Verse 38, what else did he do? We see in verse 38, he says, sit here with me and watch. He asked for their care, for their comfort and their support. Stay here with me. Be with me while I'm going through this. Verse 39, he prayed fervently and repeatedly. Even when they fell asleep on him, he went back and he prayed again. It was so intense that he fell down to his knees and knelt and prayed. Finally, we see in the end of verse 39, when he had placed it in God's hands, what did he do? He got up and he went on about what he had to do and what was coming and trusted that God would take care of it. So if you look at the flip side of that, what did he not do? Well, again, he didn't hide and run from it like Jonah did. We have an example of that, Jonah chapter 1. I'm going to go someplace where I don't have to do this. He didn't question his faith in God and say, man, how could God love me if he's asking me to do this? Why would he do that? He didn't go to the philosophers. He didn't read any great books to go and see and self-help books to see what would have helped him in the situation. It's also interesting to note that he didn't blaspheme or curse God the way that Job's wife wanted Job to do. He didn't stir up Peter and his other disciples by sitting around thinking. Think about the conversation now, because we're going to start pulling this into us here in just a minute or two. Start thinking about the conversation. He didn't sit around with Peter and say, can you believe I'm having to go through this? I can't believe this, man. Man, this is horrible. He didn't stir them up. He didn't tell them he was angry. Didn't tell them all these things, stir them up. He didn't complain that he was the only one staying faithful through all this like Elijah did. He didn't try to protest it, stop it, or create a rebellion. In fact, we find the opposite was true. If we look in verses 47 through 56, and we won't read that for the sake of time, but we know that as Judas's plan to betray him plays out, they come into the garden. What's the first thing that happened? If we look at John's account in John 18, we find out it's Peter, but he pulls out his sword and he's ready to defend him. Jesus not only doesn't allow it, he rebukes him and says, put that away. That's not what I'm about. And we find at the very end of that, verse 36, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. We can find many, many other examples throughout the Bible, throughout history, of very difficult circumstances in life. I'm sure every one of them created times of high stress and anxiety. We can look at Paul. 2 Corinthians 11, Paul lists all the things that he had been through, shipwrecks and murders and robbers, and I've been left for dead, I've been beaten, I've been shipwrecked, all these other things. And he finishes it, he said, above all this, the pressures of the concern for all the churches. But what was Paul's response to those things? Again, let's look at a compare and contrast. Paul's response to them in Philippians chapter 3 was, I press on. I press on toward the goal. How can I press on when all these things are happening? That's tough to do. I've got all these things coming at me. Well, Paul tells us how he did it. 2 Timothy 1, verse 12, for this reason I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded. Not I think, I'm persuaded, I'm convinced that he is able to keep those things which I have committed to him until that day. You see, when we believe, when we trust in God's love, we trust in his power, we trust in his control like Paul did, then we too can have that same ability to press on. No matter what the world throws at us, we can press on. It doesn't derail us, doesn't cause us to lose our faith. We press on. We can see other examples of this again in the New Testament, a couple of those, and again we'll go through quickly. Matthew 4, verses 1 through 11. Jesus is tempted by Satan. Every time he's tempted, in the same ways that we're tempted, what was his response? It is written. It is written. It is written. Over and over again. He goes directly to the Word anytime that he is tempted. We look at Matthew chapter 8. His disciples are in the boat and they're facing a terrible storm and they're starting to be afraid for their life. What is Jesus' response to that when they're kind of freaking out about it? He not only calms the seas, but he calms his disciples as well. Acts 14. Paul is stoned outside of Lystra and left for dead. What was his response to that event of high stress? And I'm telling you, I can't find one higher than that in my categories. What is his response to that? He rose up in verse 20, went into the city, went to Derby the next day, and did what? Preached the gospel. And we see that he continued to do that from town to town, even went back to that same town. Acts chapter 16, another example. Paul and Silas are beaten, put into the inner prison, and this isn't your typical county jail. This is an inner, dark, dank prison. Feet were in stocks. Pretty stressful again. A lot of anxiety, as you could imagine. What was Paul and Silas' response to that? They prayed and sung hymns. Okay, we're going to pull all these things together here in the next couple of minutes. But we see those same things. Acts 6, later in that chapter, they worked, preached, encouraged, fasted. They didn't go back, and you don't hear they complained, you don't hear they ran away, you don't hear they quit, you don't hear they challenged God. So throughout history, we can continue to see example after example after example of these things. Again, we go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 9. There's always been immorality. There's always been bad leaders, bad kings, making bad decisions. And we'll see some of these examples. Again, we've mentioned some of these. We'll go through them very quickly because we'll start pulling them together. But you look at Solomon and Rehoboam's taxation on the people. So heavy they could hardly stand up under it. What does Rehoboam do? Instead of easing it by the advice of some, he increases it more. Right? So we see a lot of these things. You look at the story of our very familiar Sodom and Gomorrah. We see riots in the street. We see them beating down the doors. We see some of these things today, brethren, but they're not new. They're not new to God, nor they're not new to the world as well. Look at captivities. We mentioned these earlier, the mass infanticides of babies. We look at corrupt leaders. Ahab end up having Naboth killed so he could take his land because he wanted it. We hear corrupt leaders all the time. We hear it on the news. Depending on which news you watch is which one it's talking about. But we hear this all the time, and it creates stress in us. Constant wars and invasions. We talk about peaceful transfer of power. That's a pretty new concept. We look at Jehoram, he actually killed all of his brothers, right? And so we see these types of things, power being transferred through taking of life. Sacrificing children to the idols. Elijah, I'm outnumbered. Nobody else. I'm the only person in this county, the only person in the state, the only person here that wants to worship. We see racism between the Jews and the Samaritans. We see class prejudice around tax collectors and rich men and poor men. Famines, droughts. Again, you begin to see that these things that we're experiencing today can all be tied back to things that have been seen before. So what are some of the things that cause us stress today? Is it financial turmoil that we experience? High prices, grocery prices, gas prices, high taxes going up, inflation, interest rates. What are some of the other things that keep us up at night? The political turmoil. Was an election rigged? What was the outcome of the election? Who won? Who should have won? Who did we want to win? There's corrupt leaders. And again, I'm not going to get into the politics and mentioning names. You interpret it any way you want, but it doesn't take long to listen to either of the main news, and there's going to be one side or the other that's completely corrupt. Social turmoil, homosexuality, all of the genders. A recent class we did back in the young people's class, it just amazed me when we started talking about the fact that there's some 315 some different genders. When we read in Genesis, he created them male and female. Racism, immigration, rich and poor. These are things that we see on the news, we read on our blogs, we see on social media. We see all these things, and they stress us out. I'm telling you, they stress me out, and I know from some of you, as we've talked together to share those things, that it stresses you out too. Abortion. Crime. We hear about all the crime that, in Chicago and New York, and we look at it and we watch a newscast and we say, man, what are we coming to? When somebody would do that, am I even safe going to the grocery store anymore? Jobs, climate change, all these things were referred to earlier, so I don't think we're any different than the people that took the survey, that these things stress us out. So what I wanted to do as I was going through this was I wonder what would happen if we overlaid the list of things that stress us out and the list of things that we talked about earlier. Okay? Again, just start matching them up, and if you took the time to go through and line them up, it was surprising to me exactly how well all of them aligned. And I really had trouble finding anything today that wasn't on that list on the other side, right? So the question becomes, okay, so how do we deal with these things? Where do we go for help? And I would say that most of the time, some of the things that we do are begin to blame God. Why did He cause this? Why would He allow this? We start to complain either to ourselves within our own minds or complain to others. We start feeling like a victim. Substance abuse, we lose sleep, we let it affect our health, we worry about it, we want to rise up sometimes and we talk about how could we potentially rebel against it. It's interesting, one of the other things that we do is we tend to reach out sometimes to the wisdom of the world. Sometimes the first place we go is to Facebook or Instagram and see what others are saying. And a lot of times that feeds us. And it goes from our own worries to taking on somebody else's worries and my worries building. And pretty soon I'm sharing and I'm building their worries. And it just becomes this cycle where all of us are getting more and more stressed and worried. We go to blogs. We go to self-help books. We go to podcasts. We go to a lot of things. There's nothing wrong and inherently wrong with these things, but is that the first place that we go to when we're under intense stress for the answers? And I think we're starting to build this picture now that that's not what we see as a perfect example in Scriptures. When we do these things, what impact does it have on us? When that's the way we try to handle it, what impact does it have on us? What impact does it have on our families? Think about how we allow ourselves sometimes to slip into talking about this over dinner or in the evenings, and how we address it as a mother or a father or a husband or a wife. Think about that. People are hearing your words. Am I stirring up one or the other? Am I causing them more anxiety and stress? What effect does it have on my brethren around me when I'm allowing myself to handle it in these ways? What does it have, impact does it have on my own spiritual and physical health? When we do that, does it show our faith and trust in God to deliver? Does it create a stronger faith in us with our families? Does it create a stronger faith in my brother by me doing that? Does it create a stronger faith in my co-workers? You think about the result of Paul and Silas singing and praying in prison. What was the result of that? Not only were they encouraged, but there was a conversion from that. The Philippian jailer asking him, what do I need to do? Because he knew that their reaction was different. What impact does it have? Does it create a stronger faith in ourselves, neighbors, and those we come in contact with? So the question becomes then, how can we deal with this? And we'll start to bring this to a close. Is how can we deal with this in circumstances today that we're facing in a more Christ-centered way? First of all, we can trust in God, and we read that earlier. We can pray about it. We've looked in multiple passages of that. No better one than the passage with a perfect example we looked at in Matthew 26. We can sing. We can meditate on things that are holy, trustworthy. We can come to Jesus like we read and take His yoke, and we can learn from Him. We can set our mind on things above and not this world. We can encourage one another. We can build up ourselves and the body. We can walk in the light. We can create unity. We can wait on the Lord. We can be strong and courageous. We can preach the word. We can work in the kingdom. We can pay to our governments what is due. We can control our speech. And we can forgive. So as we conclude and kind of bring our thoughts to a close, Prophet Nahum in chapter 1 verse 7 says, "The Lord is good. He is a stronghold in the day of trouble, and He knows those who trust in Him." The passage we just read earlier when we opened up our lesson was Matthew 11:28 through 30. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find" what? You will find rest for your souls. Paul believed that. Paul believed that if he went to Jesus and took on His yoke, that yoke would be light and that He would give him rest. It didn't mean he was free from consequences of a lot of different things, but he knew that he had that peace and that comfort and that relationship. 2 Timothy 1:12, we've referred to again, tells us why he was able to believe. Because he trusted God that He could deliver every single thing that He had committed to him. And we see the result of that, I just mentioned a minute ago, in Acts 16, where the Philippian jailer said, "Sir, what must I do to be saved?" That's the reaction that Paul got from his reactions, to his responses. So when we rely upon God for courage, for strength, for peace, for comfort, during times of trouble like we're facing today, brethren, He and He alone can truly provide that rest and that comfort and that peace for us. And we do that, His name is glorified and the gospel is spread just like it was in the New Testament. So the question that I would leave with you this evening is, who are you relying on? When you have these great stress things come into your life, and this is a rhetorical question, so you need to ask yourself, what are those things? Are they things of the world, politics, wars, crimes, money, relationships? Perhaps maybe sin in your life that you've not dealt with, or sin in your loved one's life that need to be dealt with and is causing stress. But more importantly, what are you doing about it? Who are you relying on for help? Is the first thing you think of to go to the wisdom of the world or the wisdom of God? Because in Matthew chapter 11, as we've read multiple times, Jesus invites you to come to Him and to be at peace and get rest. So if you've not obeyed Him in baptism, then doing so tonight from Galatians 3:27 will bring you into the contact with His cleansing blood. Because as God planned from the very beginning of time, Ephesians chapter 1, and special note, I didn't read that. I know everybody was probably expecting me to. That's where redemption is found. That's where forgiveness is found. That's where all spiritual blessings are found, including peace, safety, comfort, and rest. So if you have become a child of God through baptism, but have let the cares and stresses of this world get to you, to cause you to worry, to cause you to have stress on your relationship and distance with God, then we encourage you tonight to come forward and make that right, restore that relationship with Him while we stand and sing.